Our gospel for this second week of Lent comes to us from Mark, the 8th chapter. Jesus began to teach them that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. He said all this quite openly. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But turning and looking at his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things." He called the crowd with his disciples and said to them, "If anyone wants to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it. For what will it profit them to gain the whole world and forfeit their life? Indeed, what can they give in return for their life? Those who are ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of them the Son of Man will also be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels." This is the word of the Lord. You may be seated. Will you join me in prayer, please? O Lord, may the meditations of my heart and the words of my mouth be acceptable to you, O Lord, my rock and my redeemer. Amen. One of the things you have to do if you're going to be a Lutheran pastor is you have to go through a project called CPE. And I may have talked to you about this before. It stands for Clinical Pastoral Education. The clinical part of that's the most important thing. It has to take place in a clinical setting. For most people, and for me, this is a hospital. So you go work for a semester in a hospital, more or less full-time. Maybe you can get a class in at the same time. I did. That's important to the story. I went to a place called Cedar Riverside, and Cedar Riverside is in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and you get assigned to a floor, and my particular floor was a floor, a lot of people who had chronic, like lifelong, it's going to kill them, kind of lung issues. And some kids in there were pretty young. There was people who were pretty old, but pretty old is pretty old for these things, meaning that they were in their 30s. That's about as long as you live with it. And at the same time, while you're doing that, you're assigned to a cohort. And the thing about clinical pastoral education is that it really is like a post-secondary kind of thing, meaning that one of the goals of this definitely is for you to learn how a hospital works and how the hospital setting is. You spend a lot of time in a hospital as a pastor. You got to know how it works. You got to learn how to work as a team, in a cohort. And also, I was there with palliative nurses, palliative doctors, people who were kind of your buddies. Like, you got to learn how to work with them. But the last thing, and this is the most cynical part of it, is because it's very much a post-secondary thing, you're there to do some doctoral graduates work for them. To be honest with you, they're trying to write a paper about something, and you are what they're writing about, and your experiences. So you do a lot of that too. Now, it just so happened that the person I was assigned to, let's call her Kathy for the sake of the argument. I don't know if she'll ever find this or not, but she's actually a good friend of mine. I like her a lot. She was writing her dissertation on shame and on the harmful effects of shame on the body, on the person, in relationships. And so her job was basically to find out from all of us as we were talking to patients in their rooms what sort of experiences they were going through, how they could be helped through dismantling the shame in their lives, getting rid of the things that made them ashamed. On my wing, there was a lot of that. There were people who were keenly aware that their body had betrayed them, that they were dying, that they were unable to do most of the things that normal kids that their age wanted to do. They knew that they were different. They knew they didn't belong. They knew they were stuck there. Lots of shame. Lots of feeling that way. And then the other thing is this cohort. So it was a funny cohort. There was me. There was an ex-alcoholic. There was this guy who was covered head to toe in self-harm wounds that had healed and become scars. And there were these two women, they were young, who just could not have been more on each other's nerves the entire time. Have you ever been in a setting like this, by the way? Have you worked with people before where it's not you, it's two other people, but their friction just defines everything in the room all the time? And maybe this is a family dynamic for you, maybe this is a workplace dynamic, maybe it's a friend group that you're a part of, or you experience this somewhere else, but you can't get out of the cohort. You're stuck with these people, and there's constant friction, and like the anxiety in the room is up to 11. And it was all just coincidentally shame-based. See, I think when people enter into the ministry and they do some of the tough things, especially CPE is tough. CPE can be really tough. You really want people to see you for who you are as a competent human being. I know that's how I felt. That's the first thing I did when I started CPE, is I was like, I'm going to prove these people that I know what I'm doing, because they have the say over whether or not I get to be a pastor if I don't do a good job here. So I'm going right up to that floor. I'm going to march into the first room that I see, and I'm going to give that person spiritual care whether they like it or not. There, I'll show them. And that's what I did. But these two women both of them wanted to be seen as competent. Both of them wanted to be seen as people who were destined for the priesthood. And while they were supposedly using the language of support with one another, hey, why don't you try doing this? Or hey, I've got a suggestion for you. Each and every one of those comments landed on a tender wound that just hurt. And constantly they were abrasive with one another. Constantly it was blowing up. It took the passive-aggressive, and sometimes we just took the passive right out of there. It was a toxic scenario. So anyway, this was the setting, and I kind of regret my CPE experience in some ways, because I kind of wish that we had a more functioning cohort. I kind of wish that was there. But at the same time, too, I know that our Kathy, as she was watching this go down, was highly interested. She wanted to see shame in action. She wanted to see how human beings were behaving this way. So I remember at one point in time, Kathy and I had a good relationship back and forth where we could talk about a lot of things. I eventually said to her that I don't know if I agree with your thesis about everything you're doing with shame right now. I said to her, first of all, I do want to say I very much appreciate it. This is the highest order observation of shame as a pathology that I've ever seen. And it's going to be useful in my ministry from ever on out, because shame definitionally is different than guilt. I want to say that. You know for a fact as a pastor you're going to meet people who are guilty. They've done something. That's what it is to be a human. But I didn't realize, and I learned from her a lot more about what it means to meet somebody who believes that guilt is inherent on their very soul, that it defines their person, that they are now not a person who did something bad, but a bad person. And that's how they go through life, is believing that about themselves. Being able to dismantle that was a gift she gave me that I will always treasure. But her point of view was, shame's just bad, full stop, end of sentence. It is just a bad thing. And I said, Kathy, at the same time that we're talking about this, I'm taking a class at Luther Seminary all about shame in the ancient world, the honor-shame system. Our gospel passage today is the best proof text for it you'll find, right? Jesus here is talking about being ashamed of and being shame-filled, and instead flipping that into a script of honor, right? So the first whole passage that Peter takes such exception to is when Jesus goes through the teaching about what's going to happen to him in his life. If you don't know the honor-shame context of the crucifixion and everything leading up to it, you could just say that it's a very violent scene, but it is so much more than that. Everything that happens to Jesus, from him being stripped, to mocked, to beaten, to be put out in public, to carrying a cross, to putting a crown of thorns, an inversion of all these things, is a mockery. It's a thing designed to discredit Jesus in an honor-shame culture. He's shamed for this. And the Bible talks all over the place about the shame that fell upon Jesus. Again, this is meant to discredit him, certainly, but it's not good enough just to kill a guy. You also have to assure everyone else that he is not worth throwing your lot in with. Do not associate with shame-filled people, associate entirely with honor-filled people. It's also how you get anything done in an honor-shame culture is you leverage your standing, your honor, your position in society, and there's no efficaciousness to Jesus, no efficaciousness to anything that he's done or taught because of the shame. That was the way the system was supposed to work until Jesus throws a whole wrench in that by coming back from the dead and by using this shame-filled symbol to become the symbol of our church. And instead, it becomes the symbol itself of honor. However, then as now, it still is a hard thing to do to say that you're going to throw your lot in, that you are going to do something that is embarrassing. This is adjacent of shame, right? But it leads up to it. It's embarrassing sometimes to even speak some of the words that we're supposed to say to others about being Christians, right? It's no longer such an accepted thing where it's just, oh yeah, are you Christian? I'm Christian, we're all Christian. It's a little bit hard to admit that in public now. Or maybe it isn't, but there's other shame-filled things that you might have to sort of push into, embarrassing things, if you're going to follow the cross of Christ. And it takes some courage, as we talked about last week, in our week on fear, to push through those things and say, no, instead I'm going to be with the crucified one. I'm going to pick up my cross and follow you. I am going to do all these things because Christ commands it and because I believe in the inversion of the kingdom. I believe in the upside-down kingdom where those who were shamed will be honored, where those who are poor will be rich, where those who are beaten and mocked will be lifted up and declared holy. So anyway, I didn't say all that to Kathy, but the kernel. I got the kernel in there about that. I said, I don't think that the ancient world looks like this. So her point back to me was very much came from her tradition, right? She said, I'm a Unitarian. I don't care. So fair enough. When she looks at the Bible, she sees the Bible as an ancient document that we have outlived. We've moved on. Maybe there's a good kernel or two in there, but whereas I look at this document and I say that this is the norming norm, this is the foundational bedrock, this is evidence for what happened, and it's also the gospel itself, it's the good news. She says, yeah, take it or leave it. And when it comes to shame, leave it. Leave that part behind. So that left me in an interesting spot. I mean, my point of view is certainly that her vision of a progressive future where things will get better is lovely. I don't put a lot of stock in that either. And my vision of where Eden is at both ends. Both if we look back into history, I see the Garden of Eden as God's intention for us as human beings to be loved and to live forever and all of these things. And I also see a coming when that kingdom will return, where that will happen again. And maybe there are steps along the way that we need to get over. Maybe there are systems that we need to outlive and to get past. Probably true. In both directions. Nevertheless, I think what I told her is, I think that we have a misunderstanding. What do you think that I am? And she goes, yeah, you're a Lutheran, right? And I said, yes, I'm a Lutheran, right. What do you think I think about human beings? And she said, total depravity. And I said, wrong. No, you think I'm a Calvinist. That's what John Calvin said. I'm a Lutheran. Total brokenness is what we say. And she said, it sounds like the same thing. No. Way different. Way different. Our notion of what human beings are is beloved, beautiful creations of God, intended for all of the good things, perfect in every way, and completely broken by the world and the sins that we are thrown into. Completely broken. And I do want to say that. But also completely intended for good. God did not create what was bad when God created you. God created good when God created you. There should be no room for shame in that. When you look up at yourself in the mirror, I hope that you can see that, but I know that you probably don't. And that's where the total brokenness comes in. We are just in a world that tells us such negative things about ourselves, We learn to internalize that. We say it about ourselves. Heck, we live it about ourselves. We start to be the worst version of ourselves that we could imagine. And there we are, stuck in that cycle that ends up in shame. The question is, how do we break it? How do we get out of here? Well, the answer is found in the cross. It is found in the fact that we don't. It's not us that's doing it. Through the help of God, it is possible. In fact, it's only possible through the help of God. But it is founded on God's reversal of the order that happens when all of the important people of the world missed it, right? The people who were all puffed up, the chief priests, scribes, elders, all those folks who could have stood up for Jesus, who could have said all those things that would have mattered in that moment, they didn't, right? They went the other direction. They say, yeah, shame this guy. But if we are honest with ourselves about the fact that we are completely broken and that there is no utility to staying in this broken state, then what choice do we really have? Right? It must be this way. I love our first passage there about Abraham and Sarah. And Sarah, I'm sure you love it too, because it's where you get your namesake. But what I love about it is that it's God who does the naming, right? We have Abraham as our ancestor. Many people are inspired by Abraham. The faith of Abraham is really important, and that's where we'll talk about next. But it is the fact that God does that naming. God says, you have a name. This is going to be your destiny. I have done it. That's what you should know first and foremost about yourself, is that God has made you not only in the beginning to be good, but God is going and has already a plan for you where that is the state that you will return to. And whatever shame is upon you now will depart. I promise you that. Our response to all this is what we call faith. So Bishop Hazelwood this week wrote a really interesting blog post. I don't know if you read his stuff online. Notes from the Bishop, it's called. Good stuff on there. He was talking about the word faith. Pistos is what it is in Greek. I think we have a misnomer about what faith is. We tend to think that faith is intellectual acquiescence. So are you faithful about something? Have you thought the right thought? Are you solid on that? Because the history of the word faith is actually hews much closer to the language of marriage. Faith is much more about relationship. And it's about whether or not this relationship that you have with God is one that's filled with love, that's filled with trust, where you trust that God is doing this thing for you, and is filled with the intention to live together forever in harmony. If you have to do that yourself, it's a high task, but the cross proves to us that God has done everything needful for us to accomplish that already. So, I will say this. If you but accept this faith that has been offered to you, the faith of the faithful God who would die for his people so that the shame of living in this broken world might depart from them, then you will be whole again. You will be as God intended you to be from the beginning and what you will be at the end. And this is good news. Amen.